So thanks, everybody. Let me start by saying that I'm really pleased to be here. I'm really excited by the project you guys are engaged in. I'm a longtime Victorian of 30 odd years, I suppose, even more 40 odd years. So um, it's always puzzled me and confused me and annoyed me that we have so many municipalities here, and the project that you're engaged in seems to me really exciting. I also want to start by saying that I'm really grateful to be here on the traditional territory of the Songhees and Esquimalt peoples. And I say that, and many of you hear those kind of acknowledgements, sort of pro forma acknowledgements at the beginning of talks or presentations. I wouldn't be surprised if you had some territorial acknowledgement earlier this morning. But here today, I'm going to dig into that, if you like. I'm going to dig into that history of Indigenous settler relations and maybe the reasons why we should be acknowledging and being grateful to the Indigenous peoples of this. I came early. I'm supposed to speak at 1, and I came at 11 because I wanted to hear Tracy. And so I'm in for a surprise. You're in for a surprise. We're all in for a surprise. But I wanted to hear Tracy partly because I wanted to hear what Tracy was going to tell us, and I was going to want to learn from her, of course. But I also was going to adapt my presentation to make sure that I wasn't replicating things that Tracy was going to engage. So I don't have that opportunity, but I'll go. But I hope that what I'm sharing with you, well, Tracy will have her own take on it, and she'll do something different for sure. I was invited to give this talk, and I was invited to give this talk that's kind of tied the history of Victoria together from the earliest times to modern times and the evolution of all the municipalities and the Hudson's Bay Company and all of this stuff. And I said, really, if you really only want to talk for 20 minutes, and I think that's kind of what you're asking for, 20, 30 minutes, I can't do that. I teach a course in Victoria. I teach 2 courses. One is sort of Victoria history until 1849. And I teach a whole course from Victoria 1849 to 1885. So I decided to narrow my topic a little bit to this kind of founding of Victoria through to the First World War, and I'll explain to you why I chose that as I go. But I'm going to start at a place where I promise none of you have expected. I'm going to start. Well, here's my outline, I guess. This is, and I apologize that a lot of you are going to have a hard time seeing the screen, just given the room and the light. Can anybody see the screen? Yeah. More or less? Okay. I'm going to show a couple of maps that are going to be totally unusable in this venue, but I'll explain. So this is going to take us up to World War I. But as I said, I'm going to start in a place where I promise you're not expecting. And I don't know what you can see here. I don't know what I can see here. All right. Well, you see what I see, which is pretty good. This is September 27th. What's today? The 21st? 22nd today. 20, okay. So, equinox. So, in a week's time, a comet will be visible in the night sky in Victoria. That little mark on the bottom is kind of what it will look like at 1 hour before sunrise on September 27th. Okay, so as kind of modern 21st century educated people, comets, they come and go. We don't get too excited about them, especially this little tiny comet, which is going to hardly make a ripple in the cosmos. But imagine this comet, which appeared in the night sky on March 15th, 1843, it occupied half the night sky, 90 degrees of the sky. It was visible for about 3 months before it disappeared. It's called the Great Comet of 1843. But it is probably the greatest comet of the 19th century. And the reason why I highlight it now is because it appeared in the sky the same day that James Douglas arrived on the steamship the Beaver to establish Fort Victoria in Lekwung, Ontario. So today in our world, comets, we take them, come and go, but we've never, and we will never in our lifetime see a comet like this. This happens once every I don't know, several thousand years, I don't know often, but not in our lifetimes. And it hadn't happened in the lifetime of the Wangan people. And then suddenly this apparition appears in the sky, and a steamship appears in their territory, and a bunch of guys come with it. And James Douglas talks about that moment. He said, we all shook hands when we came off the steamship. And they met a young man who they believed to be the chief. He said he's about 20 years old, and he took Douglas and a couple of the officers and a missionary that came with them. And he toured them around the territory. Douglas was actually at this time looking for a location to build a fort, which he had planned to become sort of the headquarters of the Hudson's Bay Company in Pacific Northwest. So James Douglas, at the time, second in command of Hudson's Bay Company on the West Coast. On the third day after his arrival, Douglas said he spoke to the what he called the Samos people. We understand them to be the Wangan people. And I'm quoting from him. He said, and I informed them of our intention of building in this place, which appeared to please them very much, and they immediately offered their services in procuring pickets for the establishment, an offer which I gladly accepted, and promised to pay them a blanket for every 40 pickets of 22 feet by 36 inches, which they bring. So a picket, of course, is these long poles that make the outside, the perimeter of the fort. So just a couple of things to question here and come back to. So why is Douglas looking to build a fort here? Why is he, why did the Wangan offer to help build the fort? Think about that for a sec. I'll come back. But what Douglas didn't really realize when he came here in March. And Victoria and March, we're talking about what an Edenic place Victoria is. Victoria and March is, as you know, lush and green, beautiful. And he arrives, and he finds himself in a unique ecosystem in the world. Now, this map, this is part where you might have trouble seeing. Can you all hear me if I use my outdoor voice? Okay, well, I'll move around a bit. I'll use the mic as much as I can. I think probably also the video wants the mic, but in any case, this is yellow in the bottom, the Gary Oak ecosystem. And you can see that it's a, comparatively, well, it's nice. Let's see Victoria. This, which is named after the Gary Oak ecosystem, whole municipality. So Douglas arrives in this world. I want an echo there. Maybe there is an echo. Turn that off. Mute. There we go. Douglas arrives in this ecosystem, and he says, oh, here I can quote from him again. He says, the place itself appears a perfect Eden in the midst of the dreary wilderness of the northwest coast. And so different is its aspect from the wooded, rugged regions around that no one might be pardoned in supposing it had dropped from the clouds into its present position. So Douglas had arrived in this unique and amazing ecosystem, and he said the place more resembles the close, he's using a 19th century language, so I'll unpack it for you in a second, the close sward of a well-managed lead. It more resembles that than the produce of an uncultivated waste. So he could hardly believe what he was seeing. He thought this cultivated lea is like a farmland, arable land. So he thought he was landing in some kind of farm, and he couldn't believe it. It was unlike a sorry about that, technology people. That still works. But what Douglas didn't realize is he had landed in a well-managed lea. He had landed in a landscape that was managed and cultivated by the Wangan people. And this landscape, this Gary Oak meadow, and my home is up by Summit Park near Victoria. In Victoria, that's Summit Park there, Gary Oak meadow, is also a camas meadow. And camas was the key, if you like, starch food of the Wangan peoples. And they had harvested and husbanded and burnt off the land and maintained the land for centuries, probably thousands of years. Douglas had arrived in one of the premier camas fields of the Pacific Northwest. And the Wangan call camas, quite well. And so if we're looking for a kind of a name for this ecosystem, an indigenous name, or a kind of another name for the region that we're in, we could think about it as the place. And we know from oral histories, but we also know from later treaties that this land was all owned and parceled out by the different First Nations families that occupied this land. So there were 7 families and a few more out towards Sioux who I told Douglas, well, this is our family territory. This is our family territory. And we own the Camas beds that are in this, and we also own, of course, all the other resources that are in this territory. Well, Douglas arrives in March. He's struck by the lush beauty. He's struck by these open prairies, wide open prairies. He calls it like a farm. And he chooses Victoria over all the other possibilities that he had available to him, which is the whole Pacific Northwest, for his fort and for his headquarters. And why did he choose Victoria? Well, he didn't choose it because of the harbor. Victoria has a crappy harbor. Esquimalt is one of the best harbors in the world. So he didn't choose it for the harbor. He chose it because he thought that these prairies were great agricultural. He thought that this was going to be great farmland for the Hudson's Bay Company and for future colonists who might come. And anybody here who gardens in Victoria or in Saanich knows that Victoria is not good. Victoria has summer drought all summer, and there are very little water sources in Victoria. So their efforts to kind of create farmland on this vast prairie didn't work because it was a fantastic farm for the Lekwungen, but it wasn't a good farm for Europeans. This image here, I hope you can see it because it's a beautiful image. It's a Paul Kane painting from 1846. Paul Kane, one of Canada's more famous artists, visits Victoria in 1846. He provides us with the best pictorial record that we have of that era because, of course, this is pre-photographs. And he calls this image people returning from gathering camas. And in his book that he writes about the description, he describes thousands of people harvesting camas and coming back to the Songhees Lekwungen village with all of this camas. And you can't see it because it's a small image, but if you zoomed in on the image, you'd see people carrying baskets on their back, sheep with camas, which would do them for the winter. Well, Victoria is a poor place for settlement in other ways, too. It's a poor place for settlement because we have almost no water in Victoria. There's, this is a map which shows the lost streams of Victoria, and there are a few, there's Colquitts and Craigflower Creek, and then there's running into Oak Bay. Why am I not remembering the name of the creek that runs into Oak Bay? Bowker, thank you. Bowker Creek. And only the Colquitts and Craigflower actually were enough of a creek to sustain salmon populations, not even very many salmon. So the Songhees had this fantastic territory when it came to growing camas, but they kind of got the short end of the stick when it came to harvesting salmon. There's like no salmon river in their territory. So what do? Well, they invent a technology to harvest salmon at sea. So they harvest salmon by creating what they call reef net technology. And the reef net is an ingenious technology that would be established. So the salmon on the way to the Fraser River, they come up the Straits of Juan de Fuca and they hit San Juan Island, and San Juan Island is like a wedge in the middle of that strait. Most years to go up the west side of San Juan. It's kind of easier. The currents take them that way. So on the west side of San Juan Island, there are a series of reefs just offshore. And so what happens when the salmon hit those reefs, they find themselves compressed into a narrow space between the shore and the salmon. And in those exact spots, which they figured out over the centuries, they would drop these reef nets. And these reef nets were intensely productive in kind of post-contact times, and observers observed one reef net team. So you can see there's a lot of people involved there. There's the men on the reef net boats, and then the women are ferrying back and forth from the land, bringing the salmon that they're catching to cut and dry. One reef net, they could harvest 2,000 fish in a day. So these are people who have no worries about food for the winter. They've got their salmon, they've got their camas. They're living, I think anthropologists at one point call these folks the original affluent society. This is another Paul Kane sketch of the indigenous camp on San Juan Island. They would build these tents, if you like, made of tule reeds, and camp out for the summer at the reef net sites. So Douglas arrives in. Why is he establishing a post here? Well, in the background to all of this is international politics. In the background to this, there is the United States and Great Britain, who are rattling sabers about where the boundary between their two territories should be established. After the War of 1812, the United States and Great Britain agreed on a border between the two countries up into the Rocky Mountains. But beyond that point, they basically said, well, we'll decide that later. So by the 1840s, the Americans are wanting to take the whole territory, all the way to Alaska. The British are wanting to take the whole territory all the way down to Mexico. Douglas could see what was coming. Americans were flooding into the territory. Americans were attacking Mexico, provoking a war with Mexico, seizing California, seizing Arizona, New Mexico. And so he's saying, we're never going to get that territory south of the 40th parallel or the south of the Columbia River. We better have a new headquarters here north, where it will be British territory for the boundary set. So 1843, he arrives, he establishes the fort, and in 1846, the boundary is set. And the boundary, I'll come back maybe to this slide in a second, the boundary is set exactly along the 49th parallel. But, and this is really important, because Douglas had 3 years earlier established Fort Victoria, the 49th parallel stops at the water, and the boundary ducks around Victoria. If Fort Victoria hadn't been here, we would be like Point Roberts. The boundary cuts off that little peninsula, and it would have cut off southern Vancouver Island and left it in American territory. I won't go on a tirade about how the British should have been able to manage seizing that whole territory down to the Columbia River, but that's another story for another course. So this is a Paul Kane again, and shows what happens after 1843. The fort is established on one side of Victoria Harbor, right down by Bastion Square. And Bastion, of course, is that kind of tower-looking structure. You may see, if you can see the slide, it looks like a little turret. It's a bastion, and hence we have Bastion Square. And opposite Bastion Square, on the other side of the harbor, where the Delta Hotel is now, the Songhees have their village. Originally, their villages were in Cabra Bay and Esquimalt, and they actually moved their villages to be close to Victoria, the Fort Victoria. This takes me back to why they would help build Fort Victoria. Anybody have any ideas why the Songhees might have been interested in building like a fort here, like helping build a fort and welcoming these folks? They wanted to trade with them. Previously, if they wanted to trade for Western goods, they had to go all the way to Fort Langley, which was established in the 1820s, or down into Puget Sound. So that was the main reason, really. They could trade with them. They could acquire wealth from them. They could sell them their fish. They could sell them their. They didn't end up selling them camas, but they did end up selling them potatoes. Certainly the cedar and all kinds of things. And so they could basically enrich themselves in their own economy. So the Songhees, like many Northwest Coast peoples, were involved in a potlatch economy, where the central part of their manifestation was to gather resources, gather wealth, and then redistribute it to the community, and thereby enhancing their status and their family status. So Fort Victoria was like a gift to these folks who previously had many days travel to go to a Western fort. And they thought, and they weren't wrong in this regard, that they could kind of control Indigenous access to the fort. The fort was in their territory. They could be the bosses of the fort. After all, what could like 30 guys do against hundreds of thousands of Indigenous people? And in fact, that's what happened over the first few years of Fort Victoria. That the two communities got along reasonably well. They needed each other. Well, Fort Victoria needed the Indigenous people, and the Indigenous people found it useful to have these Westerners around. And when I say Westerners, Fort Victoria in the 1850s was comprised of half a dozen, maybe less, kind of, I'll call them white guys, often Scots, people like James Douglas and some names you'll recognize from some of the landmarks around here. Tommy, William Fraser Tommy, James Todd, Roderick Finlayson. these fur trader names. Peter Skeen Ogden wasn't here, but he was one of the fur traders. The fur traders gave us a lot of the place names that we have scattered around Victoria in this era. So there was these few, mostly Scots, half a dozen or so, and then the rest of the workers were this ragtag combination of French Canadians, sort of voyageur types who had come out from St. Lawrence over sometimes over generations, but sometimes just in over years. Iroquois, Haudenosaunee people from that same territory who joined the fur traders and came out and worked with them. And lots of Hawaiians who were picked up by the Hudson's Bay Company as they traveled around Cape Horn and up to Victoria by stopping in Hawaii. So, and French was the language of communication by and large in the fort, mostly. And then, of course, many of these fur traders married indigenous people, indigenous women. And so there's lots of mixed race children running around the fort, lots of family connections between the two communities. So 1843, the fort is established. 1846, the boundary is established. And Britain is looking at how America is getting kind of bellicose and, as I said, attacking Mexico, provoking a war, and decides it better put down some kind of sovereign claim to this territory. So in 1849, the Colonial Office in Great Britain makes a deal with the Hudson's Bay Company to establish colony of Vancouver Island. And in 1849, this colony is established, and it's a bit of a faux colony because there's really only one settlement, Fort Victoria, with, just I said, a few dozen people in it, and tens of thousands of indigenous people who weren't really asked if they wanted to be any part of this new enterprise. Victoria was chosen as the capital, and the Hudson's Bay Company was chosen as the kind of land agent to manage the colony because the British government didn't want to spend any money on it. So the Hudson's Bay Company then decides it's going to, because it was here first, it was here in 1843, it was here before the boundary settlement, it was here before the colony in 1849, it had the right to take some of the land of the colony for itself without payment. And so what did it do? It drew a line from Cordova Bay all the way down to Portage at the Gorge, actually, to Portage Inlet on the Gorge. It said all of this territory we're reserving to the Hudson's Bay, it's ours, because we were here first, using it for farming. And then we're going to buy all the rest of this territory, which now is Esquimalt and New Royal and some of Langford. We're going to buy it for our subsidiary, the Puget Sound Agricultural Company. Company that produced farm goods for the Hudson's Bay Company. And at first, the British government said, well, really, that's a lot of land just for, are you really farming all that land? Are you really using all that land? So ultimately, the Hudson's Bay Company scaled down their claims. And this is relevant today for certain reasons. So the Hudson's Bay Company essentially said, we own all of what's now downtown Victoria, Cook Street to the water. We're going to take this big chunk of land up, and what they called uplands, because it was land up from Cadbrook Bay. They took North Dairy Farm, and then the Puget Sound Agriculture Company took Craigflower Farm, Colwood Farm, other farms. And so those names also persist to this day. But if you look at the boundary of Victoria and Oak Bay, you'll see the boundary of Victoria and Oak Bay essentially is the boundary of Uplands Farm. That the property Uplands divides UVic and it runs down Foul Bay Road now, and is that awkward division between these two municipalities. Just a slide for color here, Craigflower Farm as it looked in, oh gosh, I don't have the date of this, but I'll say late 1850s. And again, I don't know how many of you can see and what you can see, but Craigflower Schoolhouse is shown there on the right, and Craigflower Manor on the left, and those buildings still exist up on the gorge today. You can go visit them today. Well, this world of the indigenous people and the Hudson's Bay Company sort of worked out for mutual benefit for the number of years. But in 1850, James Douglas got the notion that he wanted to secure title for the Hudson's Bay Company. And in order to do this, he wrote his superiors in London and said, I think we should actually purchase the land from the Songhees. And a few months later, actually many months later, because it takes a long time for a letter to get to London and back in those days, he gets a letter back almost a year later and says, yeah, go ahead. So in May of 1850, James Douglas asked all of the local First Nations families to come and gather and describe to him and that he wanted to come to some agreement with them about the fort and staying in the territory. And this is what we now call the Douglas Treaties. Sometimes we call them the Fort Victoria Treaties, sometimes Vancouver Island Treaties. And this gets a little complicated, so bear with me for a second here. So Douglas invites all of these folks into this gathering. They have a meeting. Some agreement is reached. Gifts are distributed. It's like a pot. She gives away blankets, hundreds of blankets. In fact, 350 blankets to the First Nation. If you remember back to that earlier, I mentioned that for every 40 pickets, something like 30 feet long and 3 feet wide, you got one blanket. So that's the value of these blankets. 300 blankets. 350. It's a lot of value in a society that was storing their value in blankets in those days. So we know an agreement was reached. The Songhees went away, the Kwanghan went away happy. But we don't know what that agreement was. Because Douglas then writes his superiors back in London. He says, I just had a good meeting with the Songhees. It was a bit troublesome, but we worked it out. But I don't know what a treaty looks like. Send me a copy of a treaty. So 9 months later, a document arrives from London. And Douglas basically makes a few small changes, but pastes the name of the First Nations onto that document. And so we have this written document, which we call the Douglas Treaties, and I prefer to call them the Douglas Forms because I don't think they actually represent the oral agreement that was made. They represent essentially Douglas's sort of interpretation of it as screened through this document that was actually originally developed for an agreement in New Zealand in the 1840s with the Maori, and then sent to London and then sent to Victoria. So this is the question. So I'm going to describe the treaties as I'm going to describe the Douglas Forms to you as they exist. They're 2 paragraphs long. And the first paragraph describes the territory, the family territory. We saw that slide earlier, which describes the territories, and we actually have that from these forms. This is where the First Nation said, our family owns this territory. And then the treaties, the next paragraph says, we, the Chiconian people, give up our land to the white people forever. In exchange for our village sites, our enclosed fields, the right to hunt over unoccupied land, and the right to fish as formerly. That's what the written form says. So I can't believe that was an oral agreement that the Lekwungen and the Saanich and others reached with James Douglas. To believe that is the oral agreement means that you believe that they didn't care about mentioning maybe their grave sites, that they be protected somewhere, their cemeteries, which were all over this land. They didn't care about harvesting medicines. They didn't care about harvesting wood. And so my own belief, my own inclination about what these treaties meant to the Lekwungen was, we see you're about 100 people here. You occupy a space that's really just a little bit around what we now call downtown Victoria, less than Cook Street, Victoria. You have a little farm outside your fort. And so what you're saying to us is you're paying for us for the right to be there. And we don't mind having you there. And we get to live our lives over on occupied territory, which is everything else, and to fish as formally, and to hunt and gather, and to perform our ceremonies and everything else. That, I'm sure, must have been close to what the Lekwungen understanding was of that agreement. So, but Douglas has this written paper, and that's the paper that gets put in the archives, and that's the paper that Indigenous people have to use now when they want to protect their hunting rights and when they want to claim fishing rights and other things. Many of you will know that in modern times, in recent times, in fact, within the last year, the Lekwungen, actually not all of those, the Songhees, but not the Esquimalt, have signed an agreement in principle for a treaty with the federal and provincial government. But it's interesting, if you look at that agreement in principle, and it's available on the government website and probably the Songhees website as well, it gives them very little pieces of land around here. In fact, practically zero land. I don't know what the cash settlement is. But if you look under fishing rights in the treaty, it says this treaty doesn't discuss fishing rights. And that's because the Douglas Treaty gave the Indigenous people the right to fish as formerly, and they want to enforce that right so they can fish fully and freely as they were promised 170 years ago. Well, I guess one more interjection before I kind of speed things up a little bit. Esquimalt was a great harbor, and the Royal Navy discovered that Esquimalt was a great harbor. And in 1849, coal was discovered in Vancouver Island, first up north and where Hardy is today, and then in Nanaimo. And so the British Royal Navy became very interested in the Northwest Coast because 1850s is exactly the moment that navies are converting to steam, and they needed coal around the world. And the Royal Navy had a base in Chile, Valparaiso, Chile. That was their Pacific station, so they could kind of enforce British rule of Britannia across the Pacific. They wanted a kind of a more British location. So the British Navy slowly moves. By 1860s, they've moved their naval base to Esquimalt. Very handy for the Hudson's Bay Company and for the colony and the later colony because they were there to help enforce things. So when the Songhees made this agreement with Douglas, this oral agreement, I don't think neither they nor Douglas could have foreseen what was going to happen 8 years later. And 8 years later, on April 15th, 1858, the good citizens of Victoria were just coming out of church. Church in those days was a small church, sorry about that, up on Church Hill, where Christchurch Cathedral is today. They were coming out of church and they looked over the harbor. You could see the harbor. And in comes the steamship. And they could see from the hill that it wasn't just a steamship, which is kind of rare on the Northwest Coast in those days. But it was crowded with people. Victoria at this time had about 250 settlers living in the community and some 700 Indigenous people. On this ship were 450 men, all heavily armed and all wearing red plaid shirts. These were the first of the Fraser River gold rush miners. And so that one ship almost doubled the population of Victoria. The village becomes overwhelmed by these miners. Here's William Hind painting of one of the miners. He's not wearing a red plaid shirt, he's wearing a green plaid shirt. And the gold here, the gold on the right was actually harvested by my neighbor from across the road a number of years ago from Leechtown. I'll come back to Leechtown, but that's gold that came right out of our backyard, that gold there. So gold is discovered, and Victoria becomes the entryway to the Fraser River Gold Rush. Gold is on the mainland. It's in the Fraser Canyon, at least at first. And so suddenly the little tiny hamlet becomes a city of several thousand people. And this is an 1860s image of Victoria. The fort is torn down in 1862 because it's getting in the way of the city. The city starts to expand out. The Songhees, as you can see from this image, if you can see it, their village is still there on the other side of the harbor in the 1860s. And the town grows up around. Now, the Hudson's Bay Company needed the First Nations, and they had, they did have centuries of working with Indigenous people, and they often married into the Indigenous community. And so the relationship between the Hudson's Bay Company and their multi-ethnic employees and the Indigenous people was generally harmonious, a relationship of mutual, I don't want to say respect necessarily, because that might be putting too much on it, but mutual harmony. The gold miners were different. The gold miners had come from California. Most of them had started in 1849, and they had come to the California Gold Rush in 1849. And with tacit approval of the authorities, they had essentially massacred the Indigenous people of California. And so these folks brought a different mentality to British Columbia. And so they brought racism, and they brought disregard for the landscape, because what they wanted was gold, not any of the products of the land. This slide shows the village there, and downtown Victoria in this era, and among the newcomers was two other different kinds of immigrants. There was Chinese who came with the gold miners up in San Francisco and established Chinatown in the ravine on the other side of Johnson Street. And an African-American contingent came up in 1858 as well, some 650 African-Americans trying to flee the racism of America, and they established themselves in Victoria. Well, Victoria prospered and grew into a city of several thousand people in the early 1860s. Another gold rush was initiated in 1862, Caribou Gold Rush. More people come through Victoria and make their way into the interior of British Columbia. In 1858, the British government decides that they have to make a colony on the mainland, so they create a colony of British Columbia. But after 1862, the initial rush, the gold mines start to diminish. The government is spending a lot of money on roads and infrastructure. And so ultimately, in 1866, these two colonies, Vancouver Island and British Columbia, combine. And at first, New Westminster is chosen as the capital of this combined colony of British Columbia. But New Westminster was a hick tent in those days. I want to say anything about New Westminster today. Victoria was this cosmopolitan center. And so most of the kind of MLAs, if you call them, the folks who would rather live in Victoria than in New Westminster. So in 1868, Victoria became the capital of this new united colony of British Columbia. But the colony was in dire straits financially. It spent too much on road building. It had spent too much on an Indian war against the Chilcotin people. And so in 1871, when Britain was kind of giving it the kind of heave-ho as a colony, and Canada was welcoming it, 1871, British Columbia joins Canada, and Victoria becomes the provincial capital. So here we see a little bit of how the town expands over the century, I guess. And you'll see that the Songhees Reserve was in the middle of this growing city on the prime harbor lands. And ever since 1858, this kind of new racist regime was trying to get them out of the city. And finally, in 1911, they were able to persuade the Songhees with a generous amount of cash and land in Esquimalt to move out of the harbor. So 1911, the Songhees moved to Esquimalt Harbor, and that's today where the Esquimalt and the Songhees reserves are side by side. Some of the smallest reserves, by the way, in British Columbia for populations of their size. So 1871, British Victoria becomes the capital of a new province, but the economics are still dire until 1878. And the promise of joining Confederation was the promise of a railway. And so in 1878, railway construction starts. The city starts to boom. And so we have what I call the golden summer of Victoria, 1880 to 1913, to the First World War. And in this golden summer, Victoria booms. It's the capital. It's helping everything that has to flow for the railway flows through Victoria. And Victoria is the largest city still until 1901. Vancouver doesn't exist until the railway is completed in 1885. And it's a small little gas town outpost until 1890. And by 1901, it has boomed and it's actually started to take over in terms of population. It's the largest city in Victoria. But people often ask, why is the capital in Victoria? Well, the capital is in Victoria because Victoria was here long before Vancouver existed. The golden summer. So Victoria's prospering, province is starting to prosper. The legislative buildings are built to celebrate Queen Victoria's Jubilee in 1897, opened as a display of our wealth and opulence. 1908, the Empress is established. There's the Capitol building again, Empress. The city becomes a manufacturing center to supply the railway and the mines and the salmon canneries, and the E&N Railway is built into Victoria in 1886. And in 1890, the first streetcars are built in the city and start to run streetcar lines out into the suburbs, allowing for the first time for people to build their houses outside of the core of Victoria, because in those days, you either walked to your work or you didn't get there because only the richest people could own a horse or own a carriage. The average people couldn't afford these things. The streetcar allowed people to come from Oak Bay and allowed from up in Saanich, out in the Esquimalt, to come into town. And so suburbs start to spread out. So that's how we get the incorporation of Oak Bay and Saanich in 1906 and Esquimalt in 1912. to say the city booms. Francis Rettenbury builds these great structures downtown, the Empress Hotel, the Legislative Building, ultimately that what we call CPR building, the steamship terminal, wax museum, various things. Samuel McClure built these fabulous Tudor houses all over, all over the city. Bay. Here's a couple of other examples. Of course, the Dunsmuir family, who make their money in coal and in railways, they built Craigdarroch and sold Hatley Castle. All is going great, and then World War I breaks out, and the city goes into a depression in World War I, that's a World War II. Whoops, that looks like a World War II poster, but I want to talk about World War I for a second. City goes into a depression, and in a way, Victoria never came out of that depression. In a way, Vancouver superseded Victoria. Manufacturing that used to be here moved to the mainland. At first, Victoria was a stop with these major transcontinental CPR Empress boats that were bringing people back and forth from the Orient. Then it becomes Vancouver, and Victoria becomes a capital, government town with a little bit of a forest industry here, and nothing much happening in the city for almost 80 or 90 years. Maybe that's too much. Almost 60 years after the war, and that's why we still have an old town in Victoria. That's why, unlike Vancouver, which prospered and boomed, unlike other cities across Canada, which don't have an old town, Victoria's old town was left there because nobody was developing in Victoria for all of those years. And it wasn't until the 1970s when a few heritage conservation folks started to make noise about saving this, what was then a derelict part of town, that Victoria's old town was preserved. I'm just going to wrap up by saying, asking, what can we take away from this pocket history of Victoria to World War I? Well, just looking back, we can see that comet of 1843, that portended this dramatic transformation of this world of the colonial peoples. But that didn't happen actually immediately, and not like you might think. Remember that 1843, the comet arrives, so does Douglas arrive, Ford arrives. But that world doesn't really change until 1858. A few hundred people, settlers, didn't make a huge impact on tens of thousands of Indigenous people. And despite the fact that they claim to, run the colony and whatever, Indigenous people lived their lives as they always had, incorporating in a small way the arrival of Europeans. It's not until racism arrives, capitalism arrives in a big way. It's not until resource extraction arrives in a big way with the gold rush in 1858 that world really was transformed. We can learn that Victoria started out as a multi-ethnic, multiracial community, a community of relative harmony, as I said. Victoria from the start, we also know both the citizens of Victoria and people far away made incremental decisions that have created the Victoria that we live in today. Small decisions made by individuals from time to time have had this huge impact over the long run. And from that, we can conclude that if humans built the world that we're living in today, humans can change that world. You guys can change that world. And so I hope that as Comet A4, this little tiny comet, kind of appears in our night sky in the next a week or so, that comet too will portend a change in Victoria, and that you guys will lead that change. So thank you very much.